Well, welcome to our final Changemaker Roundtable for Accelerate RegTech 2022. And this morning we've got the most diverse group of participants, and it might not be immediately obvious, but in actual fact it is RegTech that provides the tie that binds them together. We're going to focus this morning on federal government perspectives on deregulation and RegTech projects, corporate innovation, why it's vital, global capital trends, particularly in VC, corporate venturing and new approaches, how local government has become a new consumer, and what is it like doing business with government? And there's going to be plenty of opportunity for you to join the conversation. So please do use the Q&A button and I will get to your questions. So to our panel this morning, and just a reminder that their full bios are on the platform. Jacqui Arundell, who you would have met yesterday if you were with us, the head of emerging technology at Commonwealth Bank, where he's responsible for accelerating their adoption of new and emerging technologies. Michelle Deaker is managing partner at OneVentures, one of Australia's leading venture capital firms with $600 million in funds under management. She's also held multiple non-executive director positions in for-profit and not-for-profit organisations. Supun King-Jayawardana is the Chief Product Officer at X15 Ventures, Commonwealth Bank's VC arm. Supun is a digital and RegTech innovation specialist in financial services. He's got experience across corporate strategy, business development, innovation design and experimentation. And Lenz is a divisional manager at the Brisbane City Council and also the manager of compliance and regulatory services. And you might not know, but Brisbane City Council is actually Australia's biggest local government council in terms of population. She's responsible for the regulation of a very diverse array of functions, could be built in environment, environmental health, to animal management and parking. Good person to know if you live in Brisbane, I imagine. Jacqui Nelson is the CEO of Dekko Secure, a RegTech company that provides military-grade security, which allows government and enterprises of all sizes to easily share and collaborate on highly sensitive information. And Sandra Russell, who is Assistant Secretary of PM&C's Regulatory Policy Branch, helping drive the whole of government deregulation agenda. And previously, Sandra was at the Australian Taxation Office, bringing to life its 7-year transformation program. So an enormous welcome to all of our panel, and thank you very much for being here. We're going to pursue some of those provocations that we heard earlier, but just a couple of questions to each of our panel first. And Jacqui, I did want to start with you, and you made the comment yesterday, and indeed it's been repeated this morning, about how people are key. It's user customer centricity. I just wanted to ask you why that's so important, but also, is there an extent to which customers don't always know what they need and what problem they have?
It's a really, really great question. Actually, probably a provocative statement on top of the provocative statement. But for me, what I think about when I look at any product, at any software, any system, any algorithm that's been built is, what is the human insight or need that has driven the development of this offering? And I think it's really, really critical to keep coming back to that. And if I reflect on our approach inside the bank to human-centered design and product development, we went through kind of like innovation capability journey quite some time ago, where we actually rolled out design thinking, experimentation, agile training to about 10,000 staff in a year. And you just saw this massive shift in people from all over our technology and engineering teams actually reframing and rethinking what they're doing in the context of a customer need, whether that's a person, like a fellow employee, whether that's an end user. All of a sudden it really sharpens your thinking into what matters and what's important for them. And I think it's so important that, in particular in the RegTech ecosystem, as I said yesterday, we're really still at day one. There's so much opportunity for technology providers and players of all shapes and sizes to build amazing software that will help digitize and automate operational risk, compliance, and financial crime processes across the entire economy. And the key thing they have to continue to keep coming back to is, who is your end user? what are the jobs that they have that need to be done, and how are you making life so much better? How are you helping them become the superhero of their own story inside their organizations? And I think for me, it's really, really important. And it's not to say that, again, that, yeah, it's the kind of classic quote of, if you ask somebody who's, got a horse, do they want a car? No, I want a faster horse. And I kind of get that. But I think at the same time, still a human that's driving, and being able to understand deeply what they want, what they need to get done is just critical.
Is there an extent, though, to which you have to, if you talk to a designer, for example, not necessarily in tech, but an industrial designer, they'll often say they're the people who walk around looking at things in a way that other people don't look at them, noticing problems, noticing issues that many of us just deal with. Is there an element of that for RegTech, of just finding processes and systems that people have lived with for a long time and manage, but they might not be aware of a really obvious problem, but from a RegTech point of view, there's an issue that could be done a lot better?
Oh, completely. And if I think about the best kind of cross-functional squads that help build products and services inside the bank for our customers, you have what I call in some ways, just the trinity of the triumvirate, which is you usually have an excellent product manager that has vision, that is able to connect and understand and to lay out the roadmap and to stitch everything together to get a product out to market. You have a service designer who actually, to your point, understands deeply the human need or insight that needs to be done and is ensuring that the features that are being then built by the engineering teams are actually what customers want. And I think it's those three kind of like skills, attributes, teams, or people that is key to building any software or any product, full stop. And then if you then think about, well, okay, for the operational risk, the compliance, the financial crime functions inside large regulated entities, if you think about the application of those skills to those domains in the development of these domains, largely they haven't been there. And I think that that's the opportunity, is to say, how do you drive excellent product thinking, service design, and engineering to help solve what is a myriad of very complex, largely manual problems that exist inside regulated entities.
We'll pursue more of the sort of areas of future opportunity in a minute. But Michelle, can I ask you, what sort of global trends are you seeing in venture capital? And are you seeing RegTech get real traction?
Yeah, look, I think, Ali, in the last probably 3 years or more, RegTech has really got a lot of traction. From a venture capitalist perspective, we're looking at a number of key areas that we're really interested in. So the whole regulatory reporting side, risk management, the compliance management, identity control. This is becoming a really big issue for, major banks and all sorts of organisations, telcos, because, identity theft is becoming a bigger problem. And then you move into the whole, how do we manage, transaction monitoring, ongoing transactions? How do we know that they're valid transactions? And there's a lot of work going on with ledgers and blockchains in that area. But when we think about RegTech, probably 67% of RegTech companies are now greater than 3 years old. And of those companies, like about 40% of them are growing really rapidly. And that starts to become really attractive to venture capital industries. And between 2020 and 2021, we saw like a 73% compound annual growth rate. So the amount of funding going into RegTech companies sort of skyrocketed. It went from like 7.8 billion in 2020 globally, and it jumped to almost 19 billion in 2021. So that's like a massive investment in growth of these types of businesses. So globally, VCs are recognising that there's a really big opportunity and they want to become part of that story. And just as another sort of data point, not very long ago, most of the investments were happening were quite small, and they were into businesses that were valued at sub $50 million. But recently, we're starting to see big deals being done, companies being valued at much higher than 100 million or more. And we're also starting to see the first unicorns in this space, which is really exciting. And we've got one in our portfolio as well. So there's really a lot of exciting deal activity happening. And this early stage segment of the market is really, really starting to, mature, if you like, and start to produce some really exciting global companies. And, Australia's been positioned really well for that because we've always led the field a bit in our banking and finance sector. And young companies seeing opportunities there are then being able to take the frameworks that they build here over into larger offshore markets, which is really exciting.
And I'll get to your unicorn in a minute, Michelle, but can I just ask you that increase in funding, in VC funding for RegTech, how much of that is on the VC side a recognition of the significance of the sector, and how much of it is just the fact that you now have a far more mature industry, as you said, the number who have been around for 3 years or more?
Yeah, I'd be interested in Supun's view on this as well, but I think it's probably a combination of both in reality. Where we've seen entrepreneurs come through, they've been building these businesses. The businesses are now several years old, so they're starting to become, their product market fits there. They're starting to want to invest in growth of their businesses. And so the funding is following that trend. So the industry is sort of growing up, and then the funding is following that. And also, I think just increasing regulation and governments trying to deal with the massive shifts that's happening in the financial services industries globally means that there's going to be a lot of opportunity for young companies and entrepreneurs to fill. So I think it's a combination of those things.
I will put the question to Supun in a minute, but first of all, before I let you go, in this round of questions, tell us about your unicorn, Employment Hero.
Yeah, look, Employment Hero was a great company. So, back in 2016, we met a great entrepreneur he had an HR legal services firm, and he built a platform to help his customers onboard, their employees, the old, have the manila folder in the filing cabinet with the HR records of every employee needed to go out the window. And he decided to change that. And also he recognised the fact that small, medium businesses were struggling with the level of compliance around not only onboarding, but also making sure they were paying people to the right awards. And so, making sure they had fair and equitable pay, taking care of their superannuation, all of that through one platform. And he created Employment Hero. And we helped him pull that business out, and we invested when they had less than $1 million in revenue. And now the company has really grown up. In the last year, it took money from Insight Partners in the US. They've raised hundreds of millions of dollars, and it's a $1.22 billion company with huge global revenues and growing at almost 100% year on year. So it's a really exciting company, but they didn't stop when they just created the first part of Employment Hero and that core business, and they still only own 10% of the Australian market. So there's plenty of opportunity for them. But they started to look at what are all the other areas of, supporting the employees, whether it's ongoing training, even compliance training. So to make sure that, when they onboard, they've done the right training, the right documents are signed. But they've also moved into other things like expense management to support employers, and it goes on from there.
Supun, can I wanted to start by saying you've been in innovation in financial services for a very long time, which makes you sound really old, but of course, I wonder what you think have been the major shifts in that time. And indeed, when you look at that development, the VC development we were just talking about, Michelle, and the increase in investment, whether you think it's about recognition of importance of the sector or maturity of the sector?
Yeah, I think it's definitely both. So just echoing what Michelle said. So a bit of kind of background. I've been in the space for about 7 years. Maybe that makes me old in the space. But in terms of what's changed, certainly what I've noticed, 7 years ago versus now, touching on what Jacqui was saying, there's been a change from recognizing that we need to do more as a corporate and working with startups to actually getting to a point where we've tried to think through what are the actual organizational barriers that stop that partnership from working and trying to actually solve for them. So when I was in the UK, we had an innovation lab over in London. We were looking at RegTech, and actually there was a lot of good intent, great companies, as you can imagine, and good people within a dedicated team that said, we really want to make sure we can try to run proof of concepts or experiments with these new companies. But fundamentally, there were a lot of organizational challenges around actually taking that from an experiment and deploying that properly within the organization. Like an organization as large as CBA, or any kind of large organization. And over the last 3 to 5 years, there's been a lot more emphasis, I think, in saying actually what we need is not just dedicated designers or dedicated innovation people. You actually need dedicated risk, legal, compliance, technology, cybersecurity people within these organizations that can actually work with small companies and set up the right infrastructure so they can actually take an experiment from hey, that's a nice experiment, to actually this is a real production-like solution that an organization can actually adopt. And certainly that's one of the things that we've discovered as we've set up X15. I can talk a little bit more about X15, but how do you actually solve for those things first, so that when we go out to the a RegTech like Frankie won, for example, that I know won the competition, that there's an actual environment here that you can actually show us in like a real way what you can do to help X15, but also the broader organization like CBA.
Do you think that's a broader trend? I mean, you're talking about it in a CBA context, but do you think that is a broader trend in large legacy organizations?
I think so. So I think that generally across the industry, it's probably based on two kind of factors. One is the conversation around getting that handshake has now matured naturally, because more and more people are talking about how do you get large organizations to work with small companies in a really fast and innovative way. But also there's been new organizations that have been created that are entirely greenfields and have started using new solutions, and they're growing quickly. And so the competition for existing organizations is changing and will continue to change. And so the need to do that from the external market has increased and will continue to increase. But I think that's also driven a lot of internal thinking around what are the things we need to change to make sure we can work with small organizations in a more practical and real way.
So just give us a bit more of an insight into X15.
Yeah, sure. So we set up X15 for 3 years ago as a project, but it was 1.5 years old. Fundamentally, what X15 is how do we create a set of new digital companies to help customers, whether that be within financial services or whether that be closely linked to financial services. These are new companies that are going to go really broad across what they're providing to various customers. We've built a couple. We've also started taking investments and minority investments in existing startups, which is very exciting. And we've also bought a couple as well. But what in this conversation where it's really exciting is X15 setting up an environment where we could say, hey, we have a portfolio of 10 companies. They all probably need specific services around regulatory and compliance using modern technology. Why don't we become a really interesting experimentation bed to bring on these startups or these RegTechs and say, how do you service our portfolio of companies? We don't have some of the challenges that a established large organization might have, but if we can potentially solve or show CBA and people like Jesse, who we work with very closely, hey, this is actually working for us, how do you then also make them scale into the larger organization that is CBA? That's a really great win for both of us.
I can just urge people to take part in the poll that's currently on the platform, which is looking at extending RegTech into other industries. And of course, also you can put your questions there as well, which I will put to the panel. We spent a lot of time over the last couple of days talking about customers and putting people at the centre of RegTech. And you are the living and breathing example of the customer of RegTech and how it can help you as a local government and also ratepayers. Can you give us a couple of examples of where you've applied it and the sort of results you've had at Brisbane?
Yeah, can do. Thanks, Ali. So in BCC, we use RegTech in a whole range of different ways. And so things like mobile enforcement, remote sensing, we have predictive tools and models. We have a bundle of, goods that we call our AI tools of trade. The real focus, I suppose, in terms of all of those things, though, is it allows us to shift resources to focus on higher value tasks. So at the end of the day, we're giving a better bang for the buck for our ratepayers, and that's really what drives us to give good outcomes. In real terms, what does that mean? It means things like faster issue resolution for our customers. It means actually less customer contact. They don't have to follow us up, checking in on things numerous times. And at a very basic level, it's actually an increase in productivity. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The first one is And we kind of categorize these things a bit differently in terms of how we apply them to our business. So this one, when we talk about it, it's about something that's low risk and high volume. And it's really about automation of parts of a job. And so we have a couple of bots. We name them. One's called Mavis, another one's called Bbot. The staff actually pick and vote on their names, which is kind of cool. They have sick days, which makes them very human, but they actually have picked up parts of our process. And so for these, what they do for us is, old days, we used to have officers sitting in a car in the field trying to upload things on low bandwidth into old systems that would take forever, and they would spend a significant amount of time either in their car or in the local McDonald's using the Wi-Fi to get photos and notes into a system. Now we have bots that do that, and it's been real terms actually allowed us to allocate whole FTEs across into better tasks. The second example is where there's more high value tasks. They're still of a sizable volume, but it's where we use AI to assemble evidence for review by decision makers. So we make a whole range of decisions from a compliance and enforcement perspective every day. As part of that, we have to review evidence. And so a nice, easy example is barking dogs. Nobody likes barking dogs. We get quite a few thousand complaints from our residents about barking dogs every year. And what normally would happen is an officer would have to sit there and listen to the barking dog file to see if the dog is barking excessively once we've taken an audio recording. So obviously running AI over those audio files and allowing that to say to a decision maker, actually go to 2 minutes and 32 seconds of that recording and listen there, because that is where you will see evidence of an offence that you can actually address. Same principle around illegal dumping footage, where we take footage of illegal dumping sites, same thing, the AI says, go to this part of the video and have a look there because there's evidence of the offence. We use that in a whole range of other ways, including parking enforcement, which is never a popular topic, but you'd be surprised actually the number of people who get quite cranky about people parking in clearways and things. So again, it allows us to get to things quicker, and it saves, literally, in the barking dog example, days of time, and allows those officers to be more present in the field and to be serving customers more accurately.
So can you give us a sense of how easy it was to get that technology into place in the council, talking about legacy systems, and what sort of a customer you are? I mean, imagine the examples you've given us, you probably only had to say to someone, you're not going to have to sit there for 4 hours anymore. And they were like, yes, please give it to us. But what was it a hard sell?
No, I think the key is not trying to, and Jessie touched on this a little bit, particularly when we first started, we wouldn't have been a very good customer, but we had a...
Why not, Anne? What was wrong?
Well, we didn't actually know what we wanted. And I think sometimes we overcomplicate having to know what we want. And so what we actually did have, which was really the biggest significant thing that drove us down this pathway with a lot better speed than probably otherwise it would for a government customer, is that we had this neat little procurement pathway that allowed us to present problems to panels rather than necessarily saying, I want to buy this. Instead, we went to that panel and we said, well, here is our problem. This is what we want to solve. You tell us how, in fact, you would solve it. And so that allowed us to do lots of pilots of smaller bodies of work. We didn't kind of change massive back-end systems. Instead, we focused on interconnection, automation, and so almost like a little microcosm of things around those aging systems that allowed us to increase productivity pretty significantly. I think the other thing that we did over time was invest internally within people that assisted us to be more informed and mature buyers. And turning us more from a purchaser more into a partner. That has definitely changed over time, and that is definitely a skills and capability shift for local government. It's not something that we would traditionally recruit. It's not something that we would traditionally have in our workforce, but I have a systems and analytics team, and that's part of their role is actually about, we have a strategy that sits there around tools of trade, which is all focused on RegTech and how we improve our value for our community on a daily basis.
And that goes back to the skill set, doesn't it? Because if you don't have the people who know what's possible, you just don't have that in front of you. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, no, correct.
Yeah.
Combined, I think, with the procurement pathway piece, that's really important.
We'll pursue some of those themes in a minute, but Jacqui, if I can just bring you in now, your main customer base is government at all levels. Do you think they're an easy customer to deal with?
Well, look, I'm going to say here the short answer to that is obviously yes, but I will start by saying that I am speaking as the CEO of an Australian startup in the cyberspace. So my experience in dealing with government is solely through those lens. I've never worked inside government. So when Dekko actually started working with government departments, it was absolutely from a standing start. So that's incredibly encouraging, I think, for lots of Australian technology providers out there. And, by way of an example, back in 2018, we signed a very small deal with a very significant federal agency. And from there, we've managed to go on to be procured by both the New South Wales, the Victorian, and other federal government agencies as well. Now, I say all of this because we often hear people complaining about how difficult it is to work with government. And most of the time, those complaints seem to be around a perception of lengthy procurement cycles. And of course, when you're an Australian technology company, it's important to say that it's not just governments that have slow and protracted buying cycles. And I've personally experienced incredibly slow buying cycles in the private sector as well. But I think most importantly, some of the issues around procurement in government and enterprise actually has more to do with the lack of confidence in some of the Australian technology companies, mainly because they're new, and they're not well-known names. So, just last week I had a conversation with a government department that deeply understood the need to procure locally. And of course, we know the Sovereign Procurement Task Force has done a great job working with the New South Wales government in putting new measures in place to encourage sovereign capability and purchasing. But I think the hesitation comes from a rusted-on attachment to big tech, and of course the FUD factor when we talk about fear, uncertainty and doubt. And, moving outside of the mainstream is often a perceived risk to government and the people that need to engage with the technology in there. But here's the kicker, and I think this is the most important message to get out there, is that governments are actually buying solutions to their problems. I mean, Ange just touched on that earlier. Sometimes they don't know what the solution is, but they deeply understand their problems. So whether you're a big tech or small tech player, the advantage obviously lies with the partner that understands the customer problem, takes the time to go and sit with government at the table and get really clear about what's going on. And then, of course, you've got to be able to effectively navigate the government purchasing process. It can be difficult, but, you can be walked through it if you ask the right questions at the right point in time. And then, of course, you've got to be able to deliver and provide value for money and an ongoing commitment to service. So that's how our experience has been.
Jacqui, though, we heard yesterday from Senator Jane Hume about, government digital first, the whole digital focus. I imagine it has changed a lot, and certainly it's changed in terms of lip service. Do you think it's also changed in practice, and recognising it's not just a government issue, but do you think that digital first is a box tick or it's real?
No, I would absolutely disagree that it's a box tick. I think it is alive and well, especially here in New South Wales. I can't talk to other state departments as heavily as I can speak to New South Wales, but there is significant reform. The speed of digital transformation, the capacity and the desire for governments to collaborate with local tech providers, bring them to table, invite them onto panels to basically start to consult and help advise on some of the major transformational work that's taking place in government is really, really encouraging. We're in a situation where we do often, because of the depth of our tech capability here, we do often get asked to join the table, and those conversations are robust and are all about driving real outcomes. So I 100% agree that it's all about real reform here.
It's a very good time to bring in Sandra. You're not box ticking. Oh, you're on mute, Sandra.
No, there's lots of very active real projects happening.
Well, to give us a sense, I suppose, of why deregulation is so important to government when you could just get on with doing what you've been doing, and what progress you're making and what impact you're having with what you have done.
Thanks, Ali. And Deborah, you talked at the beginning around diverse group. So question mark about why is PM&C involved here? The Prime Minister and Minister Morton have been driving a really active deregulation agenda across all agencies. And the intent about that is making sure that regulations are well designed and set and forget. And it won't take much leap to then work into how RegTech can help support that outcome. Just to be really clear, the focus for both of them is very much on removing unnecessary regulatory burden and allowing business to get back to business. That is getting rid of those unnecessary compliance costs. Why PM&C? Minister Morton set up two functions within PM&C when he started. One is the Deregulation Task Force, which has quite a kind of known brand out in the industry. And it's taking a factory floor, or as I think Supun, you talked about, a kind of human-centered design approach to identifying pinch points and to reforming existing regulations. Ali, you asked about some of the achievements in it. The government's just announced Job Pass, which is all about enabling tradies, businesses, people to get their licenses and registrations automatically recognised across jurisdictions. They don't have to go and register in two different places. Similar to the digital economy work, another achievement for the task force is around removing impediments in the law, which mean they get rid of it, impediments to stopping how businesses and the community interacts with government and provides information to government. In summary, that task force, with a lot of other achievements, is really going deep. It's looking at pinch points in particular areas and working with agencies and across jurisdictions and with industry to help review and reform those areas.
And
yep,
Sandra, can I just ask you a very sort of simple question? With that sort of change and that sort of digital, embracing digital technology, does it matter who's in government?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I think there's enough kind of impetus here. One of the spaces that my team is looking at is not so much the deep that the task force is doing, but going wide. And it's about supporting all agencies across government, thinking about lifting their performance, and really focused in on RegTech as a lever for that. And to be clear, RegTech is not a replacement of genuine regulatory reform, but as regulators are becoming more data and digital driven, there are so many opportunities for adoption of RegTech to help streamline and modernise the way that our regulators are interacting with businesses and the community. And I see that as a kind of underlying trend which is being embraced by both sides, which will be embraced by both sides of government.
I've got a couple of audience questions. I do urge you to join the conversation. I also want to put some of our provocations to our panel as well. But before I do, I'll go to the audience questions first. This one is directed to Jacqui. Are there any standout jurisdictions or government agencies that do RegTech procurement really well? Well, I guess you sort of have to answer some things, don't you, given who's on the panel?
Yeah. No, look, absolutely. Certainly, we do a lot of work at kind of the pointy end of government in some of the most security conscious panels and channels within government. But look, some of the bigger, there's been a sort of amalgamation of big departments. We've had the Department of Communities and Justice merge with Family and Community Services here, and they are actually doing adoption of new technologies really, really well. So, it's big, it's complex, it's not always a simple path. But like I said before, if you work with the government, actually, it's important to say that within this procurement process, within some of these particular departments, they've actually installed a layer of business analysts. And that has actually been made a fantastic difference to the way that we can navigate our way through, because instead of ending up in the different silos, I mean, obviously when you're deploying security technology, you spend a lot of time in places like the Security Architecture Review Board, for example, to ensure that you don't get stuck in those places. They've brought in business analysts. It's actually helped smooth that process over and drive you through. So that's been a really significant change that we've seen probably in the last sort of 2 or so years in helping us get through. But yeah, look, I think the Department of Customer Service, everybody knows that department is forging ahead and doing great work in terms of digital transformation. And they are definitely looking for Australian capability. So I think it's just the beginning of some good good days ahead.
I love this question. I'm going to put it to you, Jacqui. I don't know if others would like to chime in afterwards, but if RegTech could be at the table when government's writing new regulations, what would it have them do differently?
This is an excellent question, and I think one that we often ponder at times, which is to say, if you think about some of the regulatory frameworks that we operate in, and oftentimes these were written, I guess, before the age of software, before the age of artificial intelligence that we're now in, and therefore the way that you can achieve compliance objectives and outcomes, the way you can deliver controls for risks fundamentally changes as a result of the technology. And so I guess if the RegTech sector and if RegTechs were to be at the table during policy formation, I actually think there would be this really interesting crucible of thinking and ideas, which is to say, well, this is the intent, this is of the regulation or the legislation, this is the protection that we want to put in place. And then I think the counter to the ecosystem would be, well, then what could you actually do to enable that or help deliver it? And how does that then inform the way that the regulation is written in itself? Supun, I know we've been thick as thieves for a number of years, and obviously in X15 there's a bit of thought on this too, but I'd be really keen to hear your perspectives on this puzzle as well.
Yeah, well, thanks, Jesse. I mean, just to add a bit to what you said, the industry, like RegTech itself, operates at a really high bar, right? Because if you're doing something experimental in this space and you get it wrong, that's a real challenge, unlike maybe some other spaces of innovation and startups. And so recognizing that it's fundamental to actually figure out how do you actually operate where you're okay with getting things wrong in a way that's contained. But it's also in a way that is not artificial. Like it has to be substantial and real enough so that people can actually learn from it and say, do you know what, I can see this scaling to actually replace how we currently do things today. That's really hard. And partly that's why kind of X15, I think, can play in that space. But if I touch upon some of the comments that were made by the panel around procurement, we've looked at procurement. Jesse and I have looked at procurement a lot over the last 7 years. But even if you solve for the procurement process of trying to get something in to run an experiment, it doesn't end there. It's not just about coming in and signing a contract. It's about how do you actually get comfort as a RegTech party that you're talking to the right people, that you actually have the right data you can play with, that not just an artificial thing, but actually you have the right infrastructure in place. How do you have the right people, like as I think Sandra mentioned, or could have been someone else on the panel, with business analysts who are on your side effectively, that can actually take you through the process once you've signed the agreement and can actually fight your fight in a way and be an advocate for you in the organization. All of those things, I think, touches upon what I was saying before, which is complex organizational barriers, whether you're a small organization or a large organization, that prevent these things from actually happening. That's, I think, what we need to solve for.
So, I mean, there's a question from Deborah here, actually, that is there a specific technology or service that's used to interface into legacy systems? And Supun, that sort of goes to that issue. How do you get confidence around dealing with the right people and find your champions, if you like?
Yeah, it's a very hard question to have.
So how long have we got?
Well, part of it is getting a better understanding of, when you're working with various teams, understanding what they've done before. Like, so what's the reputation of that particular team to actually have delivered things that have gone from experiment to, full on production. But it's tricky, right? every large organization is different, and the people that you talk to are different. So it's a tricky thing to index on that. I'm keen to hear anyone else's thoughts on that. I think that the fundamental thing that I would be asking if I was coming in to sell a particular product to an organization would be not just, hey, this is the idea, do you like it? But actually, what are the things that you've provided, whether it be a technical infrastructure to actually have data that I can access, whether it be I have dedicated compliance people that are going to actually take me through the process so that they then become an advocate. What are the things you've set up so that it goes from experiment to a proper production?
Let me ask Anne, is that sort of how, the sorts of questions you'd expect and you'd be able to answer and help with?
Yeah, I think it's also about how your clients make decisions. So that's one of the things that I think from a perspective of government and internally, and how things get from something which is a pilot to something which can be upscaled. It's about what governance exists, who has to actually endorse, because it's never sometimes as simple as the interface that you're working within for the pilot or whatever, the thing that you first create. It's actually then all of the different layers of governance you actually have to go through to get that thing into a more kind of production or ultimately enterprise view, I suppose. And so I think that is something that we've actually actively been working on in recent years, is about how we smooth that pathway and we actually don't make it too hard. And because we as government, I think we tend to be naturally risk adverse, which is actually not good when you're trying to find new ways of doing things and being able to grow things. And so it's also, I think, a bit of education piece for clients like ourselves about how we actually understand how we are to deal with, and what are we good at, which is defining the problem and providing lots of information about, and the history and all those things that Supun talked about. But it's also about understanding our own limitations as well, and knowing what we're not good at and making sure that we're actually actively managing some of those things for success.
I just want to go through some of the provocations that we heard earlier and just bounce them around the panel a bit if I can. And again, if people would like to ask a question, please do join the conversation. But Andrew Wilson put one out. Given the lessons learned through the financial services industry, would it be an easier path to success for other industries? Michelle, I'll bring you in here. Do you reckon the hard yards have been done?
I think it's a start. I think some of the Sandbox legislation that supported startups and enabled them to get their businesses going, I think has been really helpful. And I think looking at that in some other segments and industries could help the startup community. And I think just reflecting on the previous conversation as well, from a startup perspective, it's often hard to engage with, business, but at the big end, but also governments, because, they're small companies with only a few people, and governments often scare the startups because, the startup walks in with 1 or 2 people and they have a cast of 30 in the room. We need to get better at dealing with small companies and enabling them. One of the things that we see happens in the US is that any government contract that often goes out to a big player like an IBM, for example, will require a startup company to be part of the tender. And that's because the two parties can work together and they can pull through the new technology. So I think, yes, we learn a lot out of the financial services sector, work, and, it can translate.
Jesse, do you agree with that?
100%. I think it's time for RegTech to go beyond finance. In a big way. It is the first of many markets for RegTechs, and shouldn't be the only destination they're thinking about. And I think about that in 2 different ways. I think first is that what we typically see is the RegTech providers and solutions that are out in market that are helping with operational risk and compliance processes. If you think about risk management frameworks that exist inside large regulated entities or enterprises, full stop. That software could be used in telcos, could be used in big pharma, could be used in a whole range of other industries, because everybody has risk management frameworks and they have obligations they have to comply with. They have complex controls that they need help with administering and governing. And if I think about the second kind of tier of specific problems that certain RegTech providers are trying to solve, there are going to be examples where you can lift and shift your technology or your solution into another market, or into another industry. And then there's times where you're going to have to evolve them to meet the niches and the different contexts that the problems exist that you're trying to solve in other industries. But I think it is totally time for RegTech to go beyond finance.
Jacqui, can I put a provocation to you? This one was from Andrew Stevens. How will the level of knowledge your business has about your your existing and your desired customers stack up against ecosystem operators who have complete knowledge of them? And how do you feel about competing if your answer is not well?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. Look, obviously, goodness, I mean, how do you even start to answer that question? It's obvious that a small company with a brand that's not well known is never going to be able to take it up against the big guys. I think the secret comes back to something that I said earlier. It's actually building trust with government. It's coming in with a consultative approach to deeply understand the problem. Now, sometimes the deeper you get, or the closer you get to the problem, you actually realise you shouldn't be sitting at the table. And so having the courage to actually walk away if you don't think you should be, or push forward if you do really believe that you have the solution. We have a very open and collaborative approach to working when working with governments. It's not just about us delivering the solution. We know we're never going to be the silver bullet. We're a very, very small part of a huge problem set. So we actually often spend a lot of time looking at the larger vendors, understanding, what value they bring and the work they do very well, and then where can we actually complement those pieces of technology. And that has been a very, very successful approach to us because, like I said, there is no silver bullet. We've got, especially in the space of cyber, the level of threat is evolving every single day. What wasn't a problem yesterday will most definitely be a problem tomorrow. And so we all have to be thinking and working together and cross-collaborating.
Michelle, do you have a thought on that? You were nodding at the beginning of Jacqui's answer.
No, I do. I just agree with what she was saying. So, I think getting that cross-collaboration is important.
The other one, which is an issue that we did talk about a little yesterday as well, but Jane Adams' commentary around the need for skilled workers, which we've also touched on, but just, the whole idea of what is special about you. Supun, I mean, it's a major problem, isn't it? Because, and there was a headline, I think, in the Fin Review just yesterday or the day before, talking about this global war on talent and, not only the sector, the country, the space, there's so much that you have to compete against.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think there's anyone here that isn't facing that, whether you're a large organisation or a small organisation. And it's not just engineering talent, it's all kinds of specialist talent, whether it be risk people, whether it be product people, whether it be designers. Really difficult. I think one thing that we've been trying to work through is there are constraints. You can't necessarily change all those things that we're operating within. How do you create an environment that is as conducive to allowing people to do their best work? And that can be in the engineering field, right? How do you make sure that the infrastructure and tools you have means that people are spending time building things that they're passionate about rather than dealing with some of the inefficiencies or kind of manual processes that might exist today? That's really the things that you can control. But it is a real challenge for us and for everyone, I think, globally, that may not go away anytime soon, unfortunately.
Michelle, do you see that too when you look at various potential investments?
Just about all our companies are short of skilled labour. And in fact, Employment Hero is an example. I think they've got like 40 roles open at the moment. And that's across the organisation, from, just people who are doing the coding work and product development through to people in sales and marketing in the organisation, people producing the content, because they do a lot of content work when the government brought out single touch payroll, all of a sudden, small business in Australia had to know how to do that, and they didn't know how to do it. And Employment Hero spends a lot of time educating the market on the new compliance frameworks coming out, but they need people to do it, and access to staff and skilled labour. And we've just had 2 years where we haven't been bringing people into the country. And in fact, a lot of people left the country because they couldn't maintain their visas and, and also wanted to go home and see families. So we, hopefully that'll start to turn around, and some of the new policies and frameworks the government's putting in. Even just recently, they're allowing people who have been here on working visas to actually apply for a more permanent type of visa. Some of these initiatives, I think, are going to help address the problem. But, there's a big opportunity set there. If we can get people, we've got great entrepreneurs and doing great things, and we need to be able to support them with, talent and a skilled workforce.
And Sandra, I assume that government is no different. You too would be affected by, a shortage of skilled workers.
Absolutely. And to link that back to some of the earlier conversation, when we think about how do we help increase the adoption of RegTech, we've got these, in my head, micro kind of approaches. There's the BRE Business Research and Innovation funding round to look at giving funding, and through budget directly, we have a lot of initiatives that are funding specific regulators to work with industry to invest in RegTech, particular projects. But at that macro level, there's a whole lot of infrastructure conversations we're having to address some of the barriers, and funding is one. Workforce capability across the sector. I'm not just talking in RegTech, but broadly. Supun, you covered it perfectly, which is, yes, we need the technical, but there's massive cultural change and approaches that we need to change in our regulators as well. But the other aspects we look at are also around how do we spur that ideas and innovation and cross-pollination by sharing use cases, because there's not a lot of visibility by regulators around some of those opportunities. And something a bit more that maybe you haven't thought about that we're thinking about quite a bit is that breaking down of silos across regulators. And RegTech gives quite an opportunity to think about not just reinforcing those silos through technology, but how do we actually connect regulators, data, information, and regulatory functions. So we're looking at it at both macro and micro level.
Mm-hmm. We're going to run out of time in a minute, but just one more question from our audience, which is, would there be learnings we could take from other highly regulated industries to cross-pollinate, for instance, pharmaceutical and healthcare, where high standards apply to further propel solutions? I suppose this also goes to the question of moving beyond financial services. Who'd like to respond to that? Supun, maybe? I don't know.
I think the short answer is yes, although I'm not an expert in those industries, so I'll leave that to other members of the panel that might be across those industries. The learning fundamentally, if you think about industry content aside, it's if you're operating in an environment where the bar is so high, let's accept that. So we need to create an environment where the bar can be a little bit lower, but it's safe.
I think we do a lot with the pharmaceutical and healthcare space as a venture capital firm. And in some ways, I would say we don't want to go there. I mean, the regulatory pathways and the time, and it's so time consuming and it's very, very expensive. I think we want to keep with, an agile approach and being able to do, create those minimum viable products and get them tested in a safe harbor way, in a sort of safe sandbox environment where people can adopt, we can check that the technology works and it meets the right security standards and all the other things that we need. So I would say we probably don't want to go down that path if I'm just putting it out there, and, just provide more facility for young companies to come through and to trial and test their products.
Mm-hmm. We've only got less than 2 minutes left, so if I could just very briefly ask each of you, and Anne, sorry, I'll start with you. I guess what we asked what would happen if RegTech was sitting at the table when policy was being made, but what about if you were sitting at the table in a RegTech office? What would you tell them about how they could better pursue their business?
I think the problems for government are things that are actually not that hard to work out. And so it's actually in terms of how you find or provide solutions to those problems and how you explain your solutions to those problems, I think is really important. And so our constraints and context in government is also actually readily able for people to work out. I think, as Jacqui was saying before, like when you navigate through our procurement processes, if you ask the right people the right questions at the right time, it actually isn't that hard. And so it's about understanding some of the ways that we do business, which actually, once you kind of grasp that, we're not that bad. So it's about being able to understand the context and have the right conversation with us. And when that happens, we actually have some really, really great partnerships.
Yeah. And Sandra, again, we're almost out of time. You agree?
Totally agree. And just to link back to that prior point, is that, yes, often we're trying to solve an issue, but part of the challenge and the beauty of government is the interconnectedness. So kind of thinking that step ahead around how these connect into other regulators and other government functions to help business, because they don't want to be dealing over here with one platform, over here with another platform. How do you connect it? And New South Wales government is doing a fabulous job of that.
All right. Just really quick, Michelle, something that you think would really help RegTech?
I just think maybe coming back to that point I made earlier, is if, government's going out to do procurement work, and they don't just think about the big IBM, but they actually say in their contracts that they've got to bring in a young, company with, fresh ideas as part of that process. And I think then those young companies will get the ability to do things at scale in, bigger organisations, and often they're much more innovative.
Jesse?
I think my guidance or steer would be, again, focus on your customers, focus on the end users of your products and your platforms inside regulated entities, and think beyond finance.
Supun, which I know you are thinking beyond finance if you look at what X15 is doing.
Yeah, we are. And then just to add on to Jesse, the only thing I'd say is at some point switch from pitching your product to actually getting comfort around the organisation, what they have in place to actually take you into production, whether that be people, processes, systems. Just get comfort around that and don't waste your time.
Jacqui?
I'd like to echo some of what Michelle said earlier. I think it's about, big and small working together, a really open and collaborative approach, looking across the whole landscape, not being too narrow in your evaluation of government and the organisations that you want to work with. And I think, there's some great work that can be done.
So go forth with great optimism, spread RegTech. A huge thank you to our panel for their insights this morning, to Michelle and to Sandra and Anne and Supun and Jesse and Jacqui. Thank you very much for your time.